be using our phones for modern conveniences. So I started to think about all the things that I can do on my phone now that I used to have to do in person. So my first job was as a grocery bag boy at Yoke's grocery store in Spokane, and every 2 weeks I would get my paycheck for about $50 probably, and I would walk down to the bank and I would stand in line with a bunch of other people who were looking to cash their paychecks. And when I got to the front of the line, I would get to the teller and she would make some chit chat and small talk, and then she would type for about 5 minutes on her keyboard and then finally hand me over the $50, right? And now I don't have to go to the bank anymore, right? Most of us, a lot of us have direct deposit. The money just magically shows up in your bank account. Or if by some reason you give me a check, and if you owe me money, please don't give me a check. But if you do, I can just take a picture of it with my phone and deposit it into my bank account, right? Don't even have to stand in that line anymore, talk about the weather with the teller. We get to skip all of that altogether. When I wanted to write a note to a girl, I had to physically take out a piece of paper and a pencil and write that note legibly so it could be read, right? And then I had to fold that note in some contraption, physically take it to that girl and put it in her hands, which is a very tough thing to do if you're an adolescent boy. Or if I wasn't feeling maybe quite as confident, you can always go with give it to her friend and tell her to give it to her, which found out the friend always reads the notes. So just word of the wise, not a great approach. Now, you don't have to have good handwriting. You can text that girl a small note of your affection, and it just goes right to her. She can get it right there. You don't have to approach her. You don't have to be in the same room as her. And if you're not even brave enough to text, you can send her an emoji. A little symbol that communicates what you're feeling about that girl. And if you're just not brave enough to send an emoji, you can go on her social media and you can scroll through a picture that she has, and you can take your thumb and you can just tap it twice. A little heart icon appears, and she knows that you liked that photo that she had. Never have to talk to her, right? We are engineering out these personal experiences, and it's not just with phones either. If you go to the grocery store, you guys notice this? There are less employees at the checkout stations, right? They have self-checkout stations. So for all you introverts, you can do your shopping, and you don't have to do that small talk stuff with a checker at the end. You can go to the self-checkout scan. You can do all that bagging yourself. You can get out of there yourself. But they even one-upped it, right? Now you can just go on your phone, order your groceries, and do grocery pickup. I thought at least a few amens, even in a Baptist church, might come from the grocery pickup line. You don't even have to get out of your car, right? You pull up, you pop the trunk, you just nod to the person. You don't even have to say a word, and then you're out of there, right? We're engineering out, in the name of convenience, all of these personal interactions that we used to have to do. And we're becoming less and less personal, even though we sometimes have the appearance of being more connected through these devices. And I'm not saying that modern conveniences and technology are bad, but I do think that we need to be introspective in how our use of those technologies is shaping us. Because when I read the Gospels, I see Jesus' way of life as a very personal endeavor. And as Christians and people who want to follow in the ways of Jesus, there's just no other way other than personally investing in relationships in order to follow and be like Jesus. Sometimes inconvenient, it's often inefficient, but the relational messiness is the only way we get to the heart and the depth of living the Christian life. So for this week and for next week, you got me for 2 weeks, we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to look at 2 stories and talk a little bit about how these 2 stories reflect the kind of personal nature that Jesus ministered and also calls us to live our lives with. So let me pray and we'll get started here this morning. God, thank you for this morning. Thank you that you came to us personally in the person of Jesus. So as we open your word today, may you show us how we can live out that same personal way of living and being and investing in people. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. If you have your Bible or your phablet, you can turn to Luke chapter 19. We will be there today. Familiar story. And in the middle of this chapter, chapter 19, Jesus says what many commentators say is kind of the key statement in the book of Luke. And that's in verse 10 when Jesus says this, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." So Jesus' primary mission was and is to rescue human beings. That we as humans have rebelled against God's ways, chosen to live in our ways, and therefore separated ourselves from God, so that Jesus' primary mission coming to earth was to live a perfect life, die in our place, and restore and repair and rescue us so that human beings could have a relationship with God, a personal relationship. Then in the book of Luke, Luke talks a lot about lost things being found. And so you have a number of parables that talk about those things, those lost things, and then they're found by someone pursuing them. And it's a picture of God pursuing us. And we also, in chapter 18, the chapter before the story we read today, we find a story where there's a Pharisee who prays this prayer. He says, "God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector." When the most self-righteous people think about the worst kind of people, they think about tax collectors. And so it's interesting that the next chapter in Luke's gospel is all about a tax collector and what Jesus thinks about tax collectors. So let me read this passage for us, this story, and we'll pause a few times as we read the first 10 verses of Luke 19, and then we will jump in here. So Luke chapter 19, verse 1 says this: "He, Jesus, entered Jericho and was passing through, and behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich." Okay, so for all of you who grew up in Sunday school and, Zacchaeus was a wee little man, that song's going through your head right now. Tax collectors, right, in the Roman world, when Rome would conquer a country or a community or a city, they found it really efficient to hire locals to do the tax collecting for them. And so local people like Zacchaeus would essentially pledge their allegiance to Rome, which kind of made them traitors to their own people. So Zacchaeus is Jewish. His people think he's a traitor for being a tax collector. And then he would go and collect those taxes, essentially charging people whatever he wanted, paying Rome what they told him to, and then keeping the rest for themselves. And so tax collectors had this legal loophole to steal from their own people whatever they wanted. And so they became wealthy and often despised. And Zacchaeus is not just a tax collector, he's a chief tax collector in a major trading hub of Jericho. Okay? Verse 3. "And he was seeking to see who Jesus was. But on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was small in stature." Okay, so he wants to see Jesus. He's too short. I can relate, right? The crowd of people around him, the same people that he's been cheating, are not letting him through. So verse 4, "He ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him," Jesus, "for he was about to pass that way." Now, tree climbing is not for dignified people, right? Tree climbing is what kids do. So wealthy, somewhat respectable men like Zacchaeus who had good positions would not typically climb trees. This just was undignified behavior. But Zacchaeus is willing to sacrifice his dignity because he wants to see Jesus so much. Verse 5. "And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, 'Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today.'" Jesus' first move, invite himself over. I like it. "So he hurried and came down and received him joyfully." Right? This is probably not what Zacchaeus is expecting. He's excited. He just wanted to get a glimpse of kind of this passing celebrity. Jesus calls him out, says, "I'm coming over." So he's super excited. Verse 7, this is how the crowd feels. "When they all saw it, they all grumbled. He's gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner." Right? They have every reason to not want anything good to happen to Zacchaeus. Verse 8, and Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. If I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. So there's probably a little bit of time that's passed in between here. Jesus and his entourage kind of come over. They probably eat a meal together. They're talking. And after Zacchaeus' experience with Jesus, he stands up and just has this speech where he declares this super generous act of giving away half of his possession, and then this act of justice in repaying everyone that he has cheated. And then finally, Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. Now, Jesus is simply acknowledging that Zacchaeus' salvation is evidenced by his generosity, not the other way around. It's not that Zacchaeus is generous, so therefore he gets salvation. Is that Zacchaeus has had this experience with Jesus and had salvation, and that salvation has driven him to be a generous person committed to justice. Right? That's the importance of that order that happens there. And then verse 10, we finish up the story seeing Jesus' main mission. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. So here's what I want to do this morning. I want to argue that Jesus' main mission to seek and save the lost is also our mission as followers of Jesus. But Jesus had a specific approach. It was a personal and relational approach to living life and ministry that was not a sales pitch. It was not a marketing plan, but it was personally investing himself into people who needed help. But there's another problem that I think this personal way of ministry helps to solve. And that's this. When you look at the church in America, statistically, 50% of our high schoolers, 50% of people who grew up in church, were involved in youth group, went to Bible study, the year after they graduate, will check out of their faith. About 50% is what the national average is. I'm not okay with that statistic. And I hope you aren't either. And so if we are going to pass on faith to the next generation, we've got to do better than 50%, right? And so the Fuller Institute did a study in 2016, and you can read about it in a great book called Growing Young by Kara Powell. It talks about what the church needs to do to reach upcoming generations. But essentially they said, well, what about those other 50%? What about the kids, maybe even a smaller percentage, who were really plugged into ministry, who continued to serve and love Jesus after they graduated? They plugged into a faith community and they grew in their faith. What was different about their experience of church than the 50% who ditched their faith? And they found out there was one big factor that made a huge difference. So typically when we think of students, a lot of times we think in terms of ratios. So when we're going to take kids to summer camp, we might say, we need one adult for every 5 students. And so what they found, what the Fuller Institute found, was when they looked at students who grew up in church, graduated and stayed connected to their faith, they found that ratio was actually reversed. That for every 1 student who stayed active in their faith, they had 5 adults who were investing in their lives in some capacity in their church. That was a common thing that they held in common, that there was 5 adults that were investing in them. Doesn't mean that all 5 were investing in the same way, the same amount of time. It wasn't even necessarily a coordinated effort by the church. But when students had 5 people, 5 adults that knew their name, that cared about them, that served alongside of them, that prayed for them, they felt known. They felt like this was a place where they could belong. And so that contributed to them staying with their faith after high school. So when we think about prioritizing the next generation of believers, I think it starts with investing personally in kids. The kids that God has given us in this community. And so there's a question that I want you to ask yourself today, that I want us to wrestle with, is who will you invest yourself in personally? Who will you invest in personally? At the end of the year, in May, we honor the seniors, and we usually bring them up here, and we just let you see who's graduating from high school. And this year we're going to do that, but we're also, in May, going to bring up all the adults who have invested in those kids over the years, from Sunday school teachers in elementary school to youth leaders to mentors to people that they served on the worship team with. And you're going to see this great picture of what it takes to invest in students and all the adults that we have that are doing that here at New Hope. But you don't have to wait until the end of the year to see that and to be involved in that. I want to encourage you to be thinking of ways today that you might invest in a kid. Okay? If you're like, hey, I don't do kids. Like, okay, I get that. I can respect that. Your invitation is still to join in Jesus' mission to seek and to save the lost. And so for you, when you think of who will I invest in personally, let's just start thinking about a coworker or a neighbor or somebody who you might be able to invest in. Okay? And my hope is by the end of today that God will give you a few names, a few places that you might be able to invest in personally. So, what does it mean to invest in someone personally anyway? I think that there are 5 questions that we have to kind of answer that really help us get to know and invest in someone personally. We're going to look at 3 of those questions this week, and we're going to look at the other 2 next week. So the first question is this: do you know my name? Okay? Do you know my name? When we think about investing personally in someone, you have to answer the question, do you know my name? Now this seems simple at first, and yet most of us are bad about remembering names. Am I right? Like, how many of you guys have been coming to church for a long time? You recognize people around you. You see them for years. They've been sitting in the same spot maybe. And when you go, Chris says, hey, turn to greet your neighbor. You're like, you roll your eyes and you say, hey, you, buddy, how's your week going? Or if you maybe walk down this front row, you might hear someone say, bro. Right? Like, I don't know your name, but I want to be friendly, and so we use these little filler words that communicate, I don't know your name, but I'm trying to fake it, right? And a name is part of our identity, which is why when we go to the DMV, it feels so impersonal, right? They don't even call your name. You're just a number, and it feels like you're just a number. There was a woman named Carmen Farina. She was a teacher in New York City and later became the head of the New York City Department of Education. Moved there in the 50s, and she was the only student in her kindergarten class who did not speak English. Her father got a postcard from the school that said, your daughter has been absent for 6 weeks. And so he was confused by this because he had been dropping off his daughter at the school every day for those 6 weeks. So he went in to talk to the teacher, and the teacher said, well, I can't pronounce your daughter's last name, and she won't respond to the name that I gave her, so I marked her absent. And this event totally shaped Carmen's policy when she got to be the department head of education in New York City. And here's what she said based on that experience. And this is a quote, this will be on the screen. Mispronouncing a student's name essentially renders that student invisible. If you don't know someone's name, or if you choose not to care how it's pronounced, you will never move to that place where you can deeply invest in someone personally. And let me say first, in response to that story, that most of the teachers I know do a really good job at that. A really good job of recognizing a kid's individuality and their name and honoring and respecting that. And sometimes the teacher is the only person who does that really well. I'd say never underestimate the power that can come from simply remembering and speaking someone's name out loud. And so in verse 5, when Jesus comes to the place where Zacchaeus is, and he calls Zacchaeus by name, uses his name out loud. In the midst of a crowd who thinks Zacchaeus is worthless, Jesus, by using Zacchaeus' name, communicates worth and value and honor. And maybe Jesus just knew the power of saying a name out loud. So the first question we have to answer when we talk about doing life personally is, do you know my name? The second question is, do you know what matters to me? Do you know what matters to me? In order to find out what matters to someone, you have to listen, you have to ask good questions, and actually be interested in the person who you're talking to. And again, in verse 5, here's what Jesus does. It says, when Jesus came to the place, he looked up. Okay, Jesus stopped, and looked up. Interestingly, in Luke 10, Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. And the story of the Good Samaritan happens on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. Jesus finds himself on that same road in this story, in real life, on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. And the story of the Good Samaritan is a story about who will stop and help someone who's in need. And here Jesus is walking on this same road, and he stops because he sees someone in a tree, someone who has a need. Jesus is also on the way to the cross chronologically. Just a few days after this event, he will go and he will be crucified in order to save the world. But on his way to save the world, he stops for one man who's in a tree seeking Jesus. The crowd saw a short, greedy, dishonest tax collector. Jesus saw a man who had thrown dignity aside to run ahead and climb a tree because he was seeking to see who Jesus was. That's what mattered to Zacchaeus. And when you take the time to figure out what matters to someone, they begin to believe that they matter too. Being in youth ministry, there's a ton of just super awkward moments that I get to experience, and it's super fun. I don't care about it at all. There's a lot of shy kids whose parents maybe have made them come to youth group, and you don't have to raise your hand if you've been one of those parents. I know. So there's this kid who was very shy, wouldn't really talk. I tried all my small talk questions. I got one-word answers. I got grunts. I got lots of things that expressed disinterest in talking to me. Gave him some space, and so there was probably 3 or 4 weeks where I had really tried to create some sort of conversation, and it just wasn't working. And then one day I noticed that he had brought a toy to church, and it was this little plastic top that you spin around and they battle each other. They're called Beyblades, and the reason that I know that is not because I do play with them personally, because my son is really into these things. There's these spinning tops and you battle them. And so I noticed this and I said, hey, is that a Beyblade? And his eyes lit up. And he's like, yeah. And so they also have a whole cartoon series based around this. And if you're asking, how do they create a cartoon series about 2 spinning tops battling each other? Yeah, that's a good question. But it's there. And so I started asking him some questions about this toy, because I knew about this toy because my son and I, we play with these. And I tell you not, he talked my ear off for like 5 minutes, and I was at the point where I said, hey, I gotta go. Can we finish this later? I gotta go. We gotta run some program stuff, but I would love to come back and talk to you afterwards about Beyblades, right? Because I found out what matters to him. I finally found what mattered to him, and when I expressed an interest in it, he opened up. And he let me into that place. And if you're going to be more personal, you have to become interested in what somebody else is interested in. Not because you're fascinated and you love it, but because you love them. And because they matter to you, what matters to them matters to you. So, we have to know, do you know my name? We have to answer the question, do you know what matters to me? And then lastly, we have to answer the question, do you know where I live? Do you know where I live? So Jesus' first move is to invite himself over to Zacchaeus' house, right? It says, hurry and come down from us, stay at your house today. How many of you, that's like your worst nightmare, is someone shows up unexpectedly and says, hey, I'm here, right? And you have not had a chance to clean your house. Yeah, like the physical spaces that we live in are some sort of representation of ourselves. And so we just hate the idea of someone else seeing our house in the natural state of disarray that it's in all week, right? And so when we have company over, we need to prepare for that. We need to clean so it looks like we have things like this. I just swept up a few things. This is how it always looks, right? But when you go and see the place where someone lives, you get a picture of who they are. Going to someone's home or walking through their neighborhood or asking them about where they grew up or their family are all ways that we learn about where someone lives, physically, mentally, emotionally. And when we know and learn about the experiences and the places that people are from, we give them hope that they are worth knowing. There's a movie in the 90s called A Time to Kill, and there's a white lawyer in the movie. His character's name is Jake, and there's a man named Carl who's a black man who's a defendant in this case. Jake is a lawyer, and he's defending Carl, this man, and Jake is trying to have this relationship with Carl, and so at one point in the movie he says, "Carl, I'm your friend." And Carl says in response, "We ain't no friends, Jake. I ain't ever seen you in my part of town, and I bet you don't even know where I live." We can't really know someone personally unless we have some idea of where they live, where they come from, their history. And we have to be willing to actually go there. We can't just stand on our side of the tracks, on our house, and invite people here. We have to be willing to go to their world, to go physically enter into where they are. And this is what Jesus does to Zacchaeus. And ultimately, the way that Jesus sees Zacchaeus changes the way that everyone else sees Zacchaeus, because Jesus is willing to go and enter into Zacchaeus' world. So, 3 questions we have to answer to be personal, to invest in people personally. Do you know my name? Do you know what matters to me? Do you know where I live? And like I said, we'll talk about 2 more questions that I think are vital to knowing and living in a personal way. But let me tell you how we're trying to answer some of those questions at New Hope in family ministry. And so when I say family ministry, I'm talking about the programs and the strategies that New Hope uses for kids age 0 to 18 and their parents and families. And so we have this strategy. It's called the Orange Strategy. We did not make this up, but we have looked at lots of different ways of doing church, and we just believe that this is an efficient and effective way to intentionally disciple the next generation. So we've been kind of slowly working on implementing this strategy over the last few years. And so in a second, I want to show you just a super short video that kind of explains what that looks like. But let me just say that at the core of this strategy is a commitment that we have as a church to make reaching the next generation a top priority for what we do. That means what we spend our time, energy, dollars, and resources. We want to pour a lot of that stuff into the next generation. We just believe that that should be a priority for our church, and that this strategy just has that underlying assumption that we will focus in on passing on the faith to next generations. It also means that we devote a large part of our time to helping to create environments. First, environments where kids will grow and naturally make connections with those 5 adults that we talked about from earlier. So whether that's Sunday school teachers or youth leaders or people that we serve with, we're constantly trying to orchestrate environments where children and mature adult disciples of Jesus can come alongside, get to know them, pray for them, care about them, and invest in them. And then second, environments that will help families and parents grow. And so if you have an elementary school kid, there's a little half sheet that you get sent home with every week. It kind of looks like this. Tells you the main message of the lesson that they learned in Sunday school, some discussion questions, some activities. It sets you up as a parent to be the main spiritual influencer of your child, which is your responsibility. And as you'll see, you as a parent have the biggest influence in your child's life and ability to follow God. And so we want to set you up to do that well by giving you some tools, some questions to ask on the way home from church when you ask, "What did you learn in Sunday school?" And they say, "I don't know." Was it about Zacchaeus? Was it about Moses? You can follow that up with a little bit of help that we give you. When you're sitting around the dinner table, there are some great questions there. If you subscribe to our Facebook page of New Hope Kids, there's some follow-up questions that are just good conversation starters so that you can integrate faith into the life and health of your family. We also I had it. I'm getting old. We also have another resource that I can't remember. That's okay. We're going to move on. I'm I'm going to think about it, and I'm going to remember it when you watch this video. So check, this 2-minute video is about the orange strategy, and it's really helpful in succinctly explaining that. So check it out. I knew you were wondering. We have this baptism packet, and this is really one of our things that we want to do. It's our heart, is that this baptism packet is meant that when your child is considering baptism, that you would go through this process and this packet with your child. That you don't turn that over to an expert. But this baptism packet has all the verses that you need, has great questions to talk to your child through, because we want you to be the primary spiritual influencer in your child's life. That's your job. That's your God-given privilege and responsibility. But we want to equip you and set you up to do that well. So we have a whole list of resources that we would love to help you do that well at home, to be the spiritual influence on your family. But the orange strategy is just that. That was a quick synopsis, that you have the light of the world, which is the church, and the heart of the family. Red and yellow, put them together, and they make orange. And so that's just kind of the thing that we want to communicate to you, that when we are aligned in our vision of reaching the next generation together, that's our hope, that we would be aligned in our purpose of influencing children to be followers of Jesus, and that as those two influences are combined, they would be more powerful than just two separate influences. And so we come back to this question of, who will you invest in personally? Who will you invest in personally? Who has God placed into your life that you have the potential to influence? If you've got a piece of paper, or if you've got a flip phone, or if you've got a giant phablet, I want you to just write down the name of someone in the next few minutes before we leave. Someone that God might have you invest in. It could be the life of a child. It could be a coworker. It could be a neighbor. And if you don't have anybody's name that specifically comes to mind, I want you to write down the words "look up." Okay, look up, because that's what Jesus did. When he stopped and he looked up, he saw someone who was in need. And I think oftentimes we are so focused and we are so driven and busy that when we move ahead, we don't even see the opportunities that God has placed into our lives. And my guess is that when we intentionally start looking for those opportunities, that God will place people in our path. People who are up in a tree looking for something meaningful, looking for Jesus. And then we get the opportunity to come in, to speak their name, to find out what matters to them, to go where they live, and to point them ultimately towards Jesus, which is what they're really looking for. So start using people's names more this week. Start asking them about what matters to them, and start going where they live. And if you want to jump in right now, we always want to present opportunities for our church to invest in the next generation. There's a slide up here with a number you can text. And that number is something that we can use to follow up with you. So if you are not plugged into kids ministry, would love to find a way, whether that's holding babies in the nursery to mentoring teenagers and everything in between, we'd love to give you an opportunity to influence the life of someone in the next generation and invest in them. So you text that message to that number. We will respond back, and we will have that conversation and figure out what might be a good place to try out and to figure out. We'd love to give you that opportunity. But here's the reality. Jesus knew our name before we were born. He knows every little detail of things that matter to us, because he created us. And he created us that we would live life with God at the center, because that's what we need. That's what life was designed to be lived like. And yet we as humans are great about putting all sorts of other things besides God at the center of our life, where we get meaning and value and purpose outside of the life God designed for us. And so our response in almost every week is this rhythm of repentance and faith, that we repent of the ways that we have placed other things in the middle and the center of our lives, and then we ask in faith that Jesus might come and take over and be more intriguing and more heartwarming and loving than anything else we could imagine in this life, that he would be at the center of all that we are and all that we do. That God came to live on this earth, not only came to know where we live, he came himself. He entered our world in the person of Jesus in the most intimate and powerful way that he could as a human being. And now his invitation is that we would join him on his mission to seek and to save the lost. But we'll never be able to do that unless we have personally experienced the kind of saving love and forgiveness that Jesus offers us through his Son on the cross. So let me pray for us as we close today. I want to just invite you again that God might put somebody's name on your heart, that you might say, I'm going to intentionally try to invest in this person. So God, thank you that you came. Thank you that you not only came to where we live, but that you became one of us, so that you could know exactly what it's like to be a human being. All the gamut of emotions and struggles, you went through those so you can relate to us in every way. And God, as you call us to live and invest in people personally, we know we fall short in that. God, we know that we fall back into things that are comfortable. We know we don't pursue people because those can be messy and difficult and challenging, and it's just easier to avoid the kind of personal interaction that comes with investing our lives in people. But because you did that for us, we can joyfully do that for you. And so give us opportunities even this week to speak life into somebody's name, to know where they live, to find out what matters to them, that they might find hope and value and worth because we see them as worthwhile. Pray these things in the powerful name of Jesus. Amen. We would love to pray for you about anything that's going on. There'll be a few of us that'll be up front here. The guys at the back are there because we take an offering about once a month just for the physical and practical needs of people in our congregation and in our community. We'd love to encourage you to give and to give generously on your way out. Thank you. Have a great week. We'll see you later.